This video will be a continuation of my series on the managerial elite. If you haven't seen the previous installments, you can click on the link that should be appearing on your screen right now. Watching it isn't absolutely necessary, but it will help put the information we're about to go over in its proper context. So previously, we discussed the origin and rise of the managerial elite. In this video, we will be looking at attempts from both the left and the right to oppose the managerial revolution, why they failed, and how those opposing movements were ultimately assimilated by the managerial state itself. In the previous video, we discussed how the managerial elite rely on the operation of mass central organizations to generate and expand their power, and how the regional autonomy of bourgeoisie institutions places limits on their growth. According to Samuel Francis in his book Leviathan and Its Enemies, managerial elites, unlike more traditional ruling classes, cannot remain in a state of consolidation and stabilization because the expansion of mass organizations, which rely on the application of managerial skills, is the essential source of their power. The managerial revolution must be perpetual, always enlarging mass organizations and extending their reach. No pockets of resistance can be allowed to hinder the growth of the system. This means that the managerial regime is in a constant conflict with non-managerial elements and will always generate new rationalizations to enlarge its organizations while discrediting and absorbing opposing ideologies. This means that managerialism does not have a conservative setting. Acceleration is its only option. As the managerial elite transitioned from a dominant minority in the wake of World War II to a burgeoning ruling class in the 1960s, two movements, one from the political left and one from the political right, attempted to oppose the ascension of the managerial elite. According to Francis, the first movement, which he calls the New Left, would arise in the 1960s and used environmentalist theories, progressive values, and the civil rights movement to challenge managerial liberalism. The New Left's failure as an anti-managerial movement was due largely to the nature of its origins. The young elites that drove the New Left were formed in mass educational institutions and enculturated by the mass media that was central to the managerial regime. Their opposition was not to the mission of the managerial class, but its failure to fulfill the ultimate goals of its ideology. The New Left was hostile to the compromises that the early managerial regime had made with the remaining bourgeoisie order. Even as the managerial revolution accelerated, the New Left were unhappy with how slowly the bourgeoisie institutions were being dismantled, and manifested this displeasure as opposition to the system in general. The managerial elite understood that accelerating too fast in the pursuit of the stated goals of the revolution could damage its own class interests, but the religious zealotry of the New Left treated this as a betrayal of the revolution and defense of the status quo. The New Left looked at the fact that poverty had not been eliminated and that the civil rights movement had not achieved total equality as proof that the system had failed, and they saw themselves as in opposition to that failed system. In reality, their radical demands all favored the expansion of managerial power and only provided cover for the continuation of the managerial revolution, making it look moderate in comparison to their radical demands. Ultimately, the failure of the New Left opposition came from its misunderstanding of managerial goals and its relationship to that movement. The New Left saw managerial globalism in the context of traditional colonization and its relationship with global finance as capitalist imperialism, when both were actually extensions of the need of managers to spread managerial systems to non-managerial societies. These forces of global integration generated powerful managerial networks and created the foundational infrastructure in third world nations that is a necessary precursor to managerial expansion. Francis says, quote, Like its critique of the managerial regime as a continuation of the bourgeoisie order, the New Left critique of American foreign policy mistook peripheral bourgeoisie and non-managerial elements as the core of American foreign policy. By concentrating its criticism on such elements, the New Left served to reduce their influence as a brake on the global acceleration of the regime and thereby to assist the process of acceleration. While the New Left eventually exerted a historic influence on the conduct of the Vietnam War, the use of force in international policy, and the adoption of restrictions on governmental and corporate policies and activities abroad, these reforms did not seriously challenge the framework of managerial globalism. In the late 1970s and through the 1980s, the development of human rights as a theme of American foreign policy, coupled with the rise of a global economy and with U.S. efforts to develop global democracy and a foreign policy centered on transitional issues such as environmental, legal, economic, strategic, and cultural problems, enabled the managerial regime to continue its global extension through the modernization of political and economic infrastructures in the undeveloped states, and thereby to encourage the emergence and interdependence of soft managerial elites in such states. Although the use of force continued sporadically, neither the force nor corporate investment in the traditional sense was essential to the main line of the managerial global integration. The New Left's misconception of the nature of the managerial regime thus actually assisted the regime in its acceleration by contributing to the rejection of bourgeoisie elements and the revision of consensus ideology, and the New Left did little to jeopardize that acceleration. Other aspects of the New Left ideology in many respects actually resembled managerial liberalism in the 1960s. Aside from its misunderstanding of the managerial regime and its rejection of technocracy, mass organizations, and managerialism, the New Left's ideology incorporated most of the progressivist premises and values of the managerial liberalism that re-emerged in the Kennedy and Johnson era. The New Left found in Marxism and its revisionist variations a new and more radical vehicle for the environmentalist presuppositions of progressivists and liberal theory, and it also revived and pushed to an extreme the progressivist interpretation of environmentalism as a basis for utopianism and cosmopolitanism. In this respect, it differed from managerial liberalism only in viewing the managerial regime itself as part of the bourgeoisie enemy, thus turning the relativist and environmentalist weapon against those whom it originally served, and in pushing the radical implications of this ideological weapon much further than the regime found it convenient or possible to go." End quote. This is why the radical left was so easily absorbed by the managerial regime. This is why a band called Rage Against the Machine has the same opinions as the CIA, and why a movement called Occupy Wall Street is in lockstep with Citibank and Goldman Sachs. They were never actually against the managerial revolution, they were simply unhappy about the pace at which change was being achieved. Francis also looks at opposition to the managerial elite by a movement he calls the New Right, which emerged in the 1970s. Much like the New Left, the New Right's managerial resistance was doomed from the start. Though viewed by the left and most of the right as an expression of bourgeoisie interests and values, it was fundamentally post-bourgeoisie in its origins and its aspirations. After the Roosevelt Revolution and its one-two punch of the New Deal and World War II, the managerial elite and their mass organizations were supplanting the bourgeoisie order and restructuring the middle class. But bourgeoisie values and social fabric turned out to have a high degree of resistance and persistence beyond the life of its institutional framework. Bourgeoisie cultural and political institutions continued to operate at the local and regional levels, even if the national superstructure had been captured by the managerial class. While carrying forward many of the bourgeoisie values, the New Right saw the writing on the wall when it came to the managerial revolution. The New Right and its organs like the National Review focused their efforts on converting the managerial intelligentsia to bourgeoisie conservative ideology. Francis believes that the class interests of the managerial elite kept them from widely adopting conservatism, whatever its merits, and this turned the New Right into a dissident faction inside the managerial elite, isolated from both its bourgeoisie base and its managerial audience, unable to meaningfully influence either. Francis says, quote, "By insulating themselves from grassroots elements and by concentrating their efforts on the managerial intelligentsia and its ideology, leaders of the conservative intellectual movement and those few politicians associated with it were selecting only one component of the managerial regime as a focus of their resistance." Under the slogan that ideas have consequences, conservative intellectuals tended to ignore the structural and organizational foundations of the managerial regime and to emphasize only its ideological extensions. In doing so, conservative intellectuals placed the cart before the horse, since managerial ideology was not the source of the dominance of the elite, but an adaptation to the regime and a reflection and rationalization of the interests of its elites. The most erudite and sharply worded critiques of managerial ideology therefore did not jeopardize the dominance of the elite, which could ignore the ideological challenge from the right because this challenge was irrelevant to and was not connected with any significant social force that resisted the organizational base of its dominance. Therefore, by seeking a dialogue with the managerial intelligentsia and by ignoring the structural basis of managerial power, conservative intellectuals generally neglected to develop a critique of the structure of the regime and gradually came to defend the structure under the illusion that the ideology and not the structure itself was the main adversary. The goal of the conservative intellectual movement was to persuade the elite to change its ideological defenses to a form of bourgeoisie conservatism, not to delegitimize and dismantle the structures by which the elite held power. Not only was this goal futile because of the incompatibility of the interests of the elite with the bourgeoisie ideology, it also eventually served to assimilate conservative intellectualism to the defense of the regime itself. By the late 1960s, conservative intellectuals took the lead in defending managerial capitalism, the managerial state, and much of the managerial apparatus of culture and communications against the New Left challenge. And long after managerial liberalism had ceased to defend the Vietnam War, deracinated bourgeoisie conservative intellectuals continued to defend the disastrous and incompetent experiment in managerial globalism. End quote. Just like the New Left, the New Right was easily absorbed into the managerial regime due to its origins inside the managerial structure, and simply ended up defending the system, not opposing it. Much of this failed resistance can also be attributed to the nature of the post-bourgeoisie groups from which the New Left and New Right were constituted. These groups were already well integrated into the managerial structure. They tended to hail from mass urban environments, be housed in mass apartment buildings, attend mass educational institutions, use mass transportation, and consume mass-produced goods pushed on them by increasingly omnipresent mass media. Despite their relative affluence, they tended to live decidedly unbourgeoisie lives. This is a consequence of the proletarianization of the middle class, according to Francis. What had been a class that was once defined by hard property ownership and independence became instead defined by a degree of affluence that still made it increasingly dependent on mass managerial organizations. Francis points to what he calls the dematerialization of property as a key step in this process. Francis says, quote, "The dematerialization of property and the replacement of the entrepreneurial firm as the dominant form of economic organization population by the mass corporation and unions under managerial control eroded both the economic power base of the bourgeoisie elite as well as the institutional roots of the bourgeoisie worldview. The reorganization of the population from the particularized, localized, private, and family and community-centered institutions of the bourgeoisie order into the massive, anonymous, highly mobile, homogenized, and routinized disciplines of the managerial regime subverted the bourgeoisie worldview and the ideologies based on it by rendering its ideas and values irrelevant to the actual lifestyles of post-bourgeoisie groups. The proletarianization of the post-bourgeoisie social formations thus consists not only in the disappearance of the economic and social autonomy through the erosion of hard property and independent ownership, but also in the cultural dispossession involved in the deracinating transformation provoked by the revolution of mass and scale and the dominance of managerial elites." End quote. We can see this phenomenon accelerating in today's world. Even the middle class are moving to a rent-to-own or subscription model for almost everything. All hard property is highly leveraged, and all soft property like media or software is delivered for a monthly fee. Almost nothing is actually owned, which is now the explicit goal of the Great Reset. The official slogan of the global managerial elite is "You will own nothing and you will be happy." Francis predicted that this would be a precursor to the final assault on the holdouts of bourgeoisie order, and that ideological rationalizations, like say environmentalism, would become necessary to justify the eradication of these last few elements which were essential to society's operation but still existed outside the stranglehold of the managerial elite. We can see this in our own headlines today as the global managerial organizations use environmental regulations to target people like farmers and truck drivers. It is no accident that the last few remaining holdouts are those that are affluent enough to have their own capital and to be independent, but are also those that are blue-collar enough to exist outside the ideological and social indoctrination of the managerial state. These actors, like farmers and truck drivers, are still essential enough and independent enough to be able to throw themselves onto the gears of the system and disrupt its operation. And this is why we see global managerial organizations coordinating to reduce or eliminate their ability to function independently. These are the final sectors that need to be conquered if the managerial regime is to reign unchallenged. Thanks for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this video, please go ahead and click like. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is a great time to do so. If you would like to support my work like these absolutely fantastic people who are currently being displayed on screen, you can do so by clicking the subscribe star link below the video in the description. That's also where you'll find links to things like my Twitter, my Gab, my Odyssey and Rumble channels. You'll also find a link to my Substack where you can get articles, and you can also get these videos and my live streams as audio only podcasts if you prefer to have them that way. So make sure you click on the link and subscribe there in case you haven't done that yet. Thanks for watching, guys, and as always, I'll talk to you next time.